She didn't slam the desk. She didn't raise her voice. But 5 minutes after being denied service at the very bank her company had trusted for years, the branch manager was fired, right there, in front of everyone. It was a warm spring morning in Atlanta, where authority often walks in wearing tailored suits and discreet luxury watches. Elena Brooks, a 46-year-old black CEO and founder of NovaTherm, a fast-scaling biotech firm, stepped out of her silver SUV, portfolio folder in hand. Her schedule was clear, her purpose straightforward: finalize the transfer of a $120 million investment account at Granite Trust Bank. It should have been a formality. She had the appointment, the documents, the title. But despite being one of the bank's most valuable corporate clients, Elena was treated like a stranger, like she didn't belong. It was just past 9 a.m. in Atlanta, the kind of morning where the sunlight hit the glass high-rises just right and the air carried the quiet confidence of a city that meant business. Elena Brooks, 46, stepped out of her silver SUV parked neatly in front of Granite Trust Bank. Dressed in a tailored ash-gray suit with a soft silk blouse beneath, her heels made no sound against the concrete. Intentional, practiced. Her hair was pulled into a low, sleek bun, and in her hand was a structured black portfolio containing the final documents for a major asset transfer. Elena wasn't just another client, she was the founder and CEO of NovaTherm, a biomedical tech company recently valued at over $300 million. She had 5 business accounts with Granite Trust, each one sizable, and she was there that morning to complete the final stage of a high-profile investment reallocation. There was no assistant trailing behind her, no security detail waiting in the car. She didn't need them. When you operate at her level, your presence alone does the talking. Elena didn't need to prove anything. Her success, her authority, her right to be there, those things were already documented, scheduled, confirmed. Her 9:30 a.m. appointment with the Commercial Finance Division was entered into the internal system 3 days ago, approved by the Regional Oversight Manager and personally acknowledged by the Account Transition Officer. Everything had been aligned. This wasn't an unexpected drop-in or some kind of cold approach. It was a routine, pre-scheduled meeting that any corporate client might have. For Elena, it was supposed to be the last of 3 steps in consolidating NovaTherm's business assets under a streamlined financial strategy. She had already met virtually with 2 executives from the team. This in-person appearance was meant to finalize and authorize the final signatures. It was a short stop between meetings, the kind of task you check off before grabbing your next espresso. Elena wasn't worried, wasn't flustered, wasn't even particularly focused on what could go wrong. Because in her world, precision was a constant. The assumption was simple. When you've done everything right, when you walk into a space prepared and professional, you expect to be treated accordingly. But that assumption was about to be shattered, not because of a mistake in paperwork, but because of something far more familiar and far more exhausting. Elena approached the reception desk with her usual calm, gave her name, and mentioned she had a 9:30 a.m. appointment with the commercial accounts team. The young receptionist tapped her keyboard, eyes scanning the screen, and was just about to nod when a voice cut through the lobby. A sharp, clipped tone wrapped in forced politeness. "Can I help you with something?" A woman in her early 50s stepped out of a nearby office, her posture rigid, her blonde bob immaculate, her name tag gleaming: Margaret Riley, branch manager. Elena turned slightly, extending a hand with a practiced smile. "Yes, thank you. I'm Elena Brooks. I have a scheduled meeting this morning regarding the NovaTherm portfolio. I believe the transition team is expecting me." But Margaret didn't take the hand. She glanced at the folder tucked under Elena's arm, her expression unreadable. "And you are with which department of the company?" she asked, her tone dipped in suspicion. "I'm the CEO," Elena replied calmly, opening the folder and pulling out the confirmation printout. "This email confirms the appointment. It's from your internal system." Margaret barely looked at it. "We don't typically allow walk-ins to access our commercial services without prior verification," she said coldly. "It was verified," Elena answered, her voice still even, as she gently tapped the top of the email with her index finger. "It's logged. Appointment ID, internal routing number, contact signature, all included." Margaret didn't flinch, Her lips pursed, and with a subtle tilt of her chin, she turned to the receptionist and said, "Call security." The air in the bank shifted instantly. The hum of background noise dulled. A man sitting in the waiting area slowly lowered his newspaper, eyes narrowing in disbelief. A young woman near the loan office subtly reached for her phone, pretending to scroll, but clearly recording. Behind the reception desk, the girl who had initially greeted Elena stiffened, her hand still hovering above the mouse. She didn't say a word, but her eyes spoke volumes. Apology, shock, helplessness. Eleanor's jaw remained steady. She had been here before, not in this building, not with this woman, but in this exact moment. Prepared, professional, and still somehow treated like an imposter. She didn't move. "You're calling security on the CEO of one of your largest incoming corporate clients?" she asked evenly, her voice low but deliberate. Margaret crossed her arms. "It's just protocol," she snapped. But everyone in the room could feel it. This wasn't about protocol. This was about perception. And in that moment, every assumption Margaret had made was about to unravel in front of a room full of witnesses. Just as the tension in the lobby seemed to tighten into something unbearable, the door to the conference room at the back of the branch opened. A tall man in a crisp navy suit stepped out, scanning the room with slight confusion that quickly shifted to recognition. "Elena Brooks," he called out, already walking toward her with a hand extended and an expression of relief. "What an honor to finally meet you. We're proud to be working with NovaTherm." The lobby, which had been frozen in awkward silence, seemed to breathe again, but not for everyone. Margaret turned pale, her arms still crossed, but her posture faltering. Elena offered a small, composed smile as she shook his hand. "Jonathan Hale, I presume," she said calmly. "Yes," he nodded. "I'm the regional director overseeing this branch." She turned to Margaret without raising her voice. "Would you like me to repeat that I had a verified appointment, brought 2 forms of ID, and presented official documentation? Or shall I assume your decision was never about protocol?" Margaret's mouth opened, but the words didn't come easily. I was just following security measures. We've had incidents lately, and I thought—" "You thought wrong," Jonathan cut in, his tone firm, professional, and cold enough to silence the excuses. "Let's be very clear. There's a difference between enforcing policy and bypassing it based on bias. You never opened her file. You ignored an appointment that was in our internal calendar. You made a snap judgment based not on data, but on appearance." The silence grew heavier. Elena didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Around them, tellers paused mid-transaction, and the receptionist lowered her eyes, visibly uncomfortable. "This is not the standard we hold at Granite Trust," Jonathan continued. "Our guidelines are designed to verify, not to profile. What happened here today was unacceptable." Margaret looked flustered, her voice trembling now. "It wasn't personal, I swear." Jonathan held up a hand. "You called security on one of our highest-value corporate clients without so much as opening her file. That's not just poor judgment, it's negligence." Eleanor took a slow breath, her gaze unwavering. "And just like that," she said quietly, "my credibility was questioned, not because something was missing, but because I didn't fit the picture." Jonathan didn't argue. Instead, he turned to the receptionist. "Can you confirm that Ms. Brooks had a 9:30 appointment in the internal calendar?" The young woman nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Logged by our scheduling system 2 days ago. Fully approved." Jonathan exhaled, looked back at Margaret, and said with finality, "We'll be discussing your position immediately after this meeting." Margaret's shoulders dropped, her composure shattered. She looked around the room, but no one came to her defense. The room had chosen its silence carefully. Eleanor said nothing more. She simply gathered her documents and followed Jonathan into the conference room, leaving behind a lobby now completely aware of what just happened, and why it mattered. Inside the glass-walled conference room, the temperature felt a few degrees colder, not because of the air conditioning, but because of what had just unfolded. Jonathan closed the door gently behind them and turned toward Margaret, who stood stiffly with her hands clasped in front of her. "Can you explain why you called security without reviewing a single document?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with disappointment. Margaret glanced down, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think she was really the CEO, she admitted, the words hanging in the air like a confession she never thought she'd have to say aloud. Elena sat at the table, her posture upright, her expression controlled. She didn't gloat, didn't interrupt. When she finally spoke, her tone was firm but not raised. I wasn't offended, she said quietly. I was dismissed. There's a difference. Margaret looked up, visibly startled. That wasn't my intention. But it was your impact, Elena cut in, still composed. You saw my skin color, my gender, my lack of entourage, and you decided I couldn't be who I said I was. You made a decision not based on facts, but on assumption. Jonathan folded his arms, his jaw tightening as he reviewed the printed internal logs in his hand. The footage shows you never opened her file. The system shows her appointment was confirmed, twice. You never scanned her ID, never called up the account. You didn't follow protocol, and that's not just a mistake, it's a liability. Margaret opened her mouth to defend herself, but Jonathan raised a hand to stop her. Let me be absolutely clear. At Granite Trust, we verify clients based on procedure, not prejudice. What happened today wasn't a slip-up. It was a complete breakdown of judgment. He took a breath, looked directly at Margaret, and said with finality, effective immediately, I am terminating your employment from this branch. The words landed like a gavel hitting wood. Margaret's face went pale. You're firing me, she whispered, after everything I've contributed. Jonathan didn't waver. You didn't just make a poor decision. You embarrassed this institution and humiliated one of our most high-profile clients in public without cause. Elena remained still, her silence speaking louder than any outburst could have. Margaret turned toward her, voice trembling. I didn't mean to offend you personally. Elena met her eyes without blinking. You didn't offend me, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. You disrespected me, and that's why you're leaving this room, not because of who I am, but because of what you chose to do. Margaret lowered her gaze, turned, and walked slowly out of the conference room. The door clicked softly behind her, but the echo of her actions remained. The fallout didn't stay inside the bank. Within hours, a short video taken by a customer in the lobby surfaced online, a quiet, steady clip showing Elena Brooks calmly presenting her credentials, while a visibly uncomfortable branch manager refused to acknowledge them. The caption read, "Watched a black woman CEO get denied service at the bank her company uses, and then watched the manager get fired 5 minutes later. I don't know her name, but I'll never forget how she carried herself." The post went viral almost instantly, racking up over 100,000 shares in less than a day. Twitter lit up with threads about implicit bias in professional spaces. LinkedIn was flooded with testimonials. Black professionals, especially women, recounting eerily similar experiences. Being second-guessed, dismissed, overlooked, despite perfect credentials. Local news outlets picked up the story first, then national media followed. Journalists reached out to NovaTherm for comment, producers requested interviews. Elena's inbox overflowed, but she didn't respond. Not right away. She wasn't looking for the spotlight. She knew how stories like these could spin, how easily the narrative could become about one viral moment rather than the decades of quiet discrimination behind it. It wasn't until 3 days later, on a quiet Wednesday morning, that she spoke publicly. On a small, independent podcast hosted by her longtime friend and former college mentor, business educator Tanya Reid. There were no cameras, no stage lights, just two women sitting across from each other in a studio lined with bookshelves and soft soundproofing. Tanya opened the conversation with care. "You've stayed quiet while the internet explodes," she said gently. "Why now?" Elena took a breath before responding. "Because this moment isn't just about me anymore," she said, voice steady. "It's about what it exposed, that even when you have the title, the credentials, the appointment, there are still places where you're treated like you don't belong. If I had yelled that day, it would have been called a scene. If I had walked away, it would have been seen as agreement. Either way, I would have lost." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering not just the bank incident, but the deeper fatigue of navigating leadership while carrying centuries of unspoken assumptions. Elena didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just told the truth, clearly, calmly, and without apology. And that, more than anything, resonated. The podcast episode was downloaded over 1.2 million times in a week. Emails poured in from other CEOs, from students, from mid-career professionals who saw themselves in her story. But Elena didn't focus on the applause, she focused on what could come next. "We don't need performative apologies," she said at the end of the interview. "We need people to learn from what they saw. Not just fire someone and move on, but examine why it happened in the first place. Because change doesn't happen when someone gets embarrassed. Change happens when someone chooses to pay attention." 2 weeks later, Elena Brooks stood at the front of a classroom at Emory University. Not on a stage, not behind a podium, just eye level with 40 business students in a mid-sized lecture hall. The invitation had come from a professor of business ethics who had followed her story online and asked if she'd be willing to speak. Not as a headline, not as a CEO, but as someone who had experienced the weight of perception in a professional world. Elena had almost said no. Her schedule was packed, and the media buzz still hadn't died down. But something about the intimacy of a classroom, a room where futures were still being shaped, felt worth the detour. She didn't bring a prepared speech, no slides, no rehearsed talking points, just her voice and her truth. You can bring everything with you: your resume, your degrees, your contracts, your performance record, she began, her voice calm and even. And still, because of your skin tone or your gender, someone will decide you don't belong. And when that happens, you have two choices: shrink to make them comfortable, or stand tall, even if the room tightens around you. The class was silent, fully locked in. A student near the front raised his hand. "How did you stay calm? Weren't you furious?" Eleanor smiled gently. "Of course I was angry," she said, "but if I had shown it, they would have called me hostile. If I had walked away, they'd say I overreacted. So I stayed. I stood there and made them confront what they were doing, in real time." Another student asked what she would say to someone just starting out who didn't have a title or track record to fall back on. She paused before answering. "Know your worth before anyone else gets a chance to define it for you. And if they try to shrink you, speak anyway, even if your voice shakes, because the moment you let them silence you, you give them permission to shape your place in the room." Afterward, the students didn't just clap, they lined up to speak with her one by one. Some wanted advice, others just wanted to thank her. A young woman, quiet and nervous, whispered, "I'm in finance." I was starting to feel like maybe I didn't belong. Eleanor met her eyes. "Then make room for yourself," she said, "and if the room won't move, change it." The lesson wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. Real power doesn't always come from raising your voice. It comes from being so rooted in your worth that you don't have to shout to be heard. In a world where bias still breathes quietly in waiting rooms and boardrooms, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to apologize for your presence. Before anyone gets to define who you are, define it yourself. Hold it close, own it, and speak it. Even if the air around you trembles. If you lead others, don't stop at firing the problem. Ask how your system allowed it to happen. Because the real solution isn't removing a bad apple. It's replanting the soil. When you choose silence, you protect yourself. But when you choose truth, you protect the people who come after you. And that, in the end, is the difference between surviving injustice and dismantling it. As the class emptied, Eleanor remained at the back of the room for a moment, watching the students file out with notebooks tucked under their arms and something heavier lingering in their expressions. It wasn't admiration, it was clarity. She knew that not all of them would remember her name, but she hoped they'd remember the moment. The stillness can be louder than shouting. The way one refusal to be dismissed could echo far beyond the walls of a bank. As she stepped outside into the soft Georgia sunlight, she didn't check her phone or glance at her calendar. She just took a deep breath, knowing this wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something better. And if this story moved you, even just a little, take a moment to share it. Because stories like Eleanor's don't just highlight injustice. They remind us what quiet courage looks like in real time. If you've ever been overlooked, questioned, or underestimated, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice might be the one someone else needs to hear today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true-to-life stories that expose injustice and celebrate resilience. Because change doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it walks in with confidence, speaks calmly, and changes everything. This is X Daily Stories, where voices rise and silence breaks.